Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business, innovation, and managing life. I always learn a bunch from this. People ask me all kinds of things that I haven't thought properly about, and this is my chance to think about them. So let's see what questions have come in here. Okay, there's one from Finn asking, do you take work problems home after work hours? What are your thoughts about a balanced work life? So maybe I'm a weird case, but first of all, I have worked from home for more than 30 years now. So there's not really a question of sort of having this transition between I'm in my work mode, I'm in my non-work mode. I think for some people, that's a very useful distinction to make. Not really, not for me, partly because I've been fortunate enough to have it be the case that the work I do is something I want to do. And for me, the more time I can work, the better, so to speak. And when it comes to things which are sort of frustrating and CEOing tech companies certainly has its frustrations of, I was just looking, as a matter of fact, I've been doing a little bit of sort of personal history research because I'm writing a thing about the creation of my big book, A New Kind of Science, which was published 20 years ago now. And I started working on it 30 years ago. And so I was reading some of the, I was looking through some of the things that happened in 1991 when I was starting to work on that book. And so I was reading, for example, raw email that I had sent out at that time, particularly internal company email. And it's kind of shocking how similar in many ways what I was writing then to what I write today is. I mean, one satisfying part of the email that I was writing then is it's kind of like it was putting in bricks in this big technological edifice that we've been building with Wolfram language and so on all these years. And there's a brick that I could see being put in 1991, and it's now somewhere in the foundations of the cathedral, so to speak. It's something which is still meaningful and useful in what we've built today, but it's something we've built on top of, so to speak. But there's also a certain amount of just why hasn't this happened? Why aren't we thinking about this in a clearer way? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That were things I was doing in 1991, and I still do them today. And I'm afraid I think it is the cross to bear for anybody who runs a company that is really trying to do new things. It's something where if you've got a company, and I see this in our company, for example, if you've got a thing that we've done many times before, okay, there's a procedure for that, there's cogs, they turn, and the thing happens. But whenever you've got something new that's going on, sometimes, somewhere, there ends up being leadership and pushing that has to happen because somebody has to have sort of the vision, they have to inject the vision, they have to communicate the vision, and that requires a certain amount of what it comes down to, tenacity, pushiness, because the natural state of any organization, even one like ours, for example, that's been sort of built to innovate, so to speak, is that the innovation will grind to a halt. You have to keep putting energy into it to have sort of new things happen. And so I think that's an inevitable feature. So that's one of the things that is one of the types of thing that at some level you might think of as frustrating, because it's like you keep on this friction there and you keep on having to push to overcome the friction. And so there's sort of a question of how do you deal with the fact that there is frustration and there are things that go wrong and so on, and there are things that go right that you're excited about, and how do you have it be the case, on the other side, there's something you're really excited about. You could spend the whole day just sort of being excited and not get anything else done, or you could spend the whole day being frustrated and not get anything else done. So there's a certain amount of, for me at least, there's a certain amount of learnt compartmentalization that I at least do a decent job, I think, of achieving. And part of that story is there's a lot of things going on. So one thing is frustrating, the chances are the next meeting will be about something that actually isn't frustrating. And even though in the first few minutes of that meeting, you're still fuming about the thing you were frustrated about before, pretty soon it's like things are good. Now, what I tend to do is if I am coming into a meeting having just come out of something which is very frustrating, I'll just say to people, I just came out of this incredibly frustrating meeting. If it's not too shocking to do it, I might even say something about what that meeting was about. And then I'll sometimes say, okay, somebody here, tell me something good. Because, once I hear something good in the next meeting, it's like, oh, that's nice. And then, whatever frustration mood there was kind of tends to, at least for me, tends to sort of melt away. But in terms of kind of the do you continue sort of looping on all these kind of questions from quotes work, or from one part of your life when you're in another part of your life? I think one of the things that I've certainly made a conscious effort to do is sort of be there in the moment, so to speak, and concentrate on what's actually happening right when it's happening, rather than wandering off to think about other kinds of things. I mean, people who worked with me for years, and I'm in some meeting, and they can tell, they're like, you're looking at something else right now. I can tell you're not paying attention. I myself am a pretty bad multitasker, and so that makes it probably even the more obvious, but also even the more sort of damaging to me if I'm not really paying attention to the thing that I think I'm paying attention to. So I tend to, I've made a sort of conscious effort to, like, when I'm doing one particular thing, I'm thinking about that thing, and I'm not off, mind wandering, thinking about other kinds of things. It's funny, in the science that I've been doing to do with multi-computation and to do with all these issues about different threads of history that operate in the physical universe and that relate to our perception of the physical universe. One of the things that's come up recently is kind of multi-way thinking, so to speak, and to what extent that sort of happens to us or doesn't. But this would be a tremendous distraction to talk about this here, but it's just amusing to me and kind of ironic, given that I'm talking about the importance of maintaining a sort of single thread of thinking about things and not getting distracted, that I could add in the distraction of this sort of scientific direction of thinking about these sort of multiple threads of that being something that's sort of imposed on us by the universe. But as a practical matter, it's part of the issue with my wife and children and things like that of to what extent are they and have they been exposed to the what I do for a living thing. One thing I've always, I have 4 kids and 3 of them are pretty firmly grown up, so to speak. They have always, I think they were aware from a young age of sort of the things that I do, and I would often talk about kind of questions, things, product ideas. They'd see different things that were going on. They'd often tell me that's a really stupid idea, and sometimes they'd be right and sometimes they wouldn't be right. I think that I always believe that for children, for example, for kids, it's kind of they're missing out on a lot if they don't know what their parents do, so to speak. I think my kids, I think it would be fair to say, they might have, in some cases, gotten fed up with hearing about different kinds of things that were part of what I do for a living, so to speak. But I think in general, it's something interesting and helpful, so to speak. And so that kind of, to some extent, sort of removes some of the, you have to compartmentalize and not take the thinking about what you're doing for a living, so to speak, quotes home with you, so to speak. I think that obviously this works differently for different kinds of people, but again, when I tend to be somebody who likes to work as much as I can, I basically work in some form or another from when I wake up until I usually take a break for dinner, and then I go back to work and I work until I go to sleep. But by work, I don't know, is for example, what I'm doing right now, work. I do this because I find it kind of interesting, and it's sort of a hobby in a sense. I don't think I wouldn't classify it as work. Actually, I'm not sure I would classify a lot of the things that I do as quotes work in in the sense of, perhaps if I was in because I do things which I like to do, and I've been fortunate enough that I've been able to set things up so that most of what I do is things that I like to do. Let's see. D0 asks, what is a shocking meeting? No, I mean more than, rather what I mean is, if I have some frustrating meeting and I don't know, I'll give you an example. We're debugging some speed issue for some piece of Wolfram Alpha, and this is a this week story, and it's like there's a sort of pushback along the lines of, oh, why are we fixing this? We're building a whole new software engineering infrastructure for doing that. We don't need to fix the thing that is right now hanging out there as a possible issue. Oh, and by the way, and we don't need to fix that. And I'm like, yes, we do need to fix that because people are using it now, and we don't know how long it's going to be before the new infrastructure is ready. It's certainly going to be a while. And by the way, what's involved in fixing the now? Oh, well, it's we've tracked it down to this obscure thing that's some kind of piece of some ingress controller of a containerization system interacting badly with some server somewhere, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, okay, and this is, I mean, this is my style of CEOing, is basically, I can kind of tell that people don't quite know what's going on. There's very good people, but they're kind of like, this is a kind of messy thing. Let's just not worry about that. We're building this great new piece of software engineering that's going to be wonderful when it's ready. But I'm like, actually, we got to look at this other stuff. And so it's pull up the documentation. What is the name of this parameter? What is it doing? How does it work? What packets is it sending from here to there? Blah, 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 blah. But there's a lot of pushback of, why are we doing this? We're just wasting a bunch of time talking about all these details. We know we're going to throw away all this stuff in the glorious future, so to speak. And that's a case where, my opinion is, and I'm, this is kind of, this is sort of what the CEOing thing to do, so to speak. We can't wait for the glorious future. We have to fix this now. And to fix it now requires actually understanding what's going wrong. And understanding what's going wrong means diving into these details. And it requires pushing to make that happen. So that's an example of something which in some ways is a kind of frustrating discussion, even though the people involved are very good people, and they're not sort of being stupid. They just are not necessarily seeing what I see as being the overall priorities. So, you're in a meeting about that, and then the next meeting is about, gosh, I can't remember what it was. It was something completely different. And so the question is, when you come into the next meeting and you're like, I'm frustrated. I was in a very frustrating meeting. There's a question of, you say why it was frustrating, and I can't even remember in that case whether I did or didn't. But sometimes it's if the next meeting is with people who will be sort of freaked out by the intensity of whatever it is that was going on in the previous one, then it's kind of responsibility to not bring that intensity. People don't sign up for being, people in certain kinds of roles don't sign up for being exposed to certain kinds of intensity. I'm being reminded by my team what the actual next meeting was. Yeah, okay. Okay. Anyway, let's see. Parmenides asks, what do you think of Elon buying Twitter? Well, I think it's a very interesting thing, and I think that I would say that it's going to be very interesting, and it's going to be an opportunity to do some very good things, I think. In fact, I had in 2019. I got kind of involved in thinking about things a little bit related to that. I got asked to testify for some Senate committee, U.S. Senate committee, about what I referred to as automated content selection on the internet. That is, there are companies like ours where we're doing things like putting out Wolfram Alpha on the web, but Wolfram Alpha is a thing where people ask a question and then we're computing the answer, and it's kind of we are responsible for generating the content that is the answer. But many companies, whether it's Google, Facebook, Twitter, their main thing is to take other people's content and to deliver it in a ranked way to the user. So it's kind of automated selection of content rather than generation of content, authoring of content, computational generation of content. It's really the main story is the ranking of content. And so the question then is, well, how should you do that? And the issue that was very evident in visiting the folks at the Senate, for example, is everybody thinks that the companies are promoting the other guy, so to speak, and that they're squashing their side, so to speak. And there was a lot. I think the angst in 2019 was fairly high. The angst in subsequent time has gotten even vastly higher about what's going on, who's getting blocked, who's being promoted, who's being demoted, all these kinds of things. And the question was that the thing that was sort of on the table there was the question of, well, if we just got these companies to show the code that they're using to do everything they're doing, would that solve the problem? And I originally sort of got wheeled into the whole thing because people knew that I thought a bit about the question of whether, if you see the code, do you know what it's going to do type thing? And that's related to a whole bunch of science that I've done about computational irreducibility, all these kinds of things. And so my original kind of expected role, what I expected was I would talk about computational irreducibility, which is kind of an interesting thing to be talking about in the context of sort of legislation type things. I think, I happen to believe that computational irreducibility will be an important part of the story of a lot of the way things have to work in the future, and an important thing for people to really understand as they try and think through kind of sort of AI and what AI means and how we sort of constrain or whatever AI to do what we want it to do. But in any case, I thought I would be talking about kind of, well, it isn't going to be enough to just see the code, because even if you see the code, you can't necessarily tell what it's going to do in a particular case. I also kind of saw this whole issue of kind of what do the AIs, and it is really AIs, provide to us on these social media and other platforms, these automated content selection systems. What do the AIs provide for us, and are they doing what we want? Are they doing, who's determining what they do? And then once there is some specification of what they should do, how does that work, and what constraints can one put on it, should one put on it, and so on. And the idea of just let's see the code, is sort of a theoretically not sufficient kind of story. And now, obviously, people kind of put into the code little if statements that say, if it's the guy I don't like, block their whatever it is. And obviously, you can find that if you open up the code. But there are much more subtle issues, and they're much more complicated things where there's some training data used for machine learning, and the training data came from this place, and the training data had some sort of pre-existing, training data necessarily has pre-existing information in it because it comes from the world as the world is. And so if the world as the world is has some prejudice about this or that, then the training data, because it is reflecting the world as the world is going to carry the same thing. But then you can argue, well, did it, do you like to have it that way, and so on? And even sort of how does that flow through the system? So in any case, I kind of, the idea of just look at the code and it'll all be good clearly wasn't going to work. And so I started thinking about, well, what is a possible way around this problem? Because the other situation you have is that somebody says, well, okay, it's all gonna be this AI, and it's just gonna be a pure AI that's gonna decide these feeds, and we're going to make the AI. So what is the objective of the AI? It's kind of like, what is its life goal? Not that it's alive, but what is its analog of a life goal? And for a company that's a for-profit company, the life goal might be just make more money. And so what does that mean? That means get people to click on those things more often, get people to look at the ads more often, get the ads to be get the content to be such that the ads will be more effective in it. Now, that leads to things, because of the nature of our species, that leads to all kinds of things. It probably leads to us being more interested the more shocking the content is, the more outrageous and out there the content is, possibly the more polarized in different directions the content is, the more it agrees with you, the more that it disagrees with the other person. Those are things that, because of the nature of our species, tend to be things that, yes, the AI discovers the nature of our species and can say, yes, if I put up this incredibly shocking thing as the first thing in this feed, more people are going to click on it. Therefore, that's what I, as the AI, whose goal is to maximize the revenue of the corporation, so to speak, will do. So then people say, but that's not what we want. We want somehow what's seen to be sweetness and light in some way or another. And so then you have to say, well, okay, let's tell the AI, in addition to maximizing revenue, add another constraint, put in sweetness and light. Okay, the AI is going to say, if the AI could say anything to us, what the heck do you mean? What do you want? And then you get stuck in this problem of how do you define what it is that you want? How do you say, okay, I want, for example, people might say, cut out all the things that aren't facts. That's kind of an absurd thing to say. In the business that I've been in for a long time of delivering computable facts, I could expound at great length about the nature of fact, so to speak, and the kinds of things that can be facts versus the kinds of things that people will say that just don't have that kind of character. Maybe it's a separate topic, but the thing that one sort of realizes is that this question about what do you want to tell the AI you want, and you realize there's no right answer to it. There's no, this is the best thing to tell the AI you want. Well, it's best to me, but it might not be best to you. And people differ in what they want. People have different kind of cultural kind of values, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so one question is, okay, well, if you're running one of these platforms, one of these systems that is doing automated content selection, you as the company behind that system could say, well, I'm going to pick what I think the AI should be, what choices the AI should be making. And those choices might be incredibly specific, ban the guy I don't like, or they might be much vaguer, promote content that has this general character or something. But in any case, you as the company operating that service could take the point of view you're going to be in charge. That's a very difficult position to be in, because many of the decisions that have to be made are essentially ethics decisions. And as I was saying, there's no right answer. What's right to one person or group of people will be wrong to another group of people, and so on. That's kind of the nature of the world and the nature of kind of the diversity of people and their opinions. So, that I think is something where you can put yourself in the position of being the one true source of ethics for the world. But if I was running such a business, that wouldn't be a position I would want to be in. It's certainly not a profit maximizing position. It's not a quality of life for the CEO maximizing position, I don't think. It's a position where, yes, if you'd taken a political science class somewhere and you learned a bunch of stuff about this, you get to, instead of just doing your course exercise, you get to actually press buttons in one of these systems to actually change, to affect what happens in this or that, political situation or whatever it is. So, but in any case, the thing that, so the question is, how do you get out of that box? And so the thing I started thinking about a couple of days before I was going to do this Senate testimony was, well, what if you just have what you might call a ranking provider? What if you have an entity that says, I'm gonna decide what the ranking is, but there are many such entities. And as a customer of the service, instead of saying, I'm stuck with whatever company X, the provider of the service of the main platform, whatever that provider says is the AI I should use, the ethics I should use effectively, what if I could just pick between a whole bunch of possible ranking providers? And one of the points there is that those providers might be things people had never heard of. They might be startups, or they might be, brands. And I say brands in a generalized sense because it might be a political organization, a church, a university, whatever. It doesn't have to be, a sneaker maker or something like that. Or it could be some influencer or some such other thing. But it's some entity that to most people stands for something. It stands for family values. It stands for edginess. It stands for whatever it is. But there's some notion of that entity. And then the idea is, can you get that entity to be the one that you can pick, to be the one selecting what's in your feed? Well, obviously you can't have, let's say that entity was some media-like company. You can't have a bunch of, editors sitting around saying, let's go sort these billion tweets or these billion, messages or billion websites or whatever it is. That's not possible. So what you have to do is you have to capture the value system of that entity somehow in an AI. You have to you said, there's no right answer for what the ethics of the AI are, but let's kind of capture the, let's do our best to capture the values of some particular entity, which may have values you as a human user agree with, you may have values that totally disagree with, but you're going to capture the values of that entity in an AI, and then you're going to use that AI to rank, select whatever the feed that you're going to get from this automated content selection system. So, back in 2019, I did talk to folks at actually both Twitter and Facebook at that time about this, and understood a certain amount about their actual machine learning pipelines and so on, and tried to understand things about how you'd actually plug in this kind of setup into those pipelines. I think I understand a little bit about how to do that at a technical level, and how to make it so that in the end, I think one would increase the total engagement of people on these platforms by having essentially extra work put in by these ranking providers, sort of providing something which would be sort of optimized for a particular, for the value system of a particular entity, which then users can select for. So actually, I just was realizing just today, I was realizing that there's a much simpler version of this that can be implemented for Twitter. And I just tweeted something about this actually, which is just to have, the analog of an app store for curated feeds. And so you could say, any organization, entity, whatever person, whatever, could put up a feed curation system. Now, it's not trivial to make a feed curation system. That's something, if you just say, well, this feed curation system just picks tweets from my 5 friends, fine, that's something, but that's not the most exciting feed curation system. The more exciting ones are ones where you really can look at the whole sort of fire hose of material that's coming through Twitter and actually choose the things and rank in some particular way. So you say, you might say, I really don't want to see, I don't know, images that I wish I hadn't seen type thing. Cut out those nasty, gory images and so on. And I just don't want that. Or I want to see this, I'm interested in, science kinds of things. I want to see this. It's kind of like a newspaper in some sense, but it's like something where it's sort of an AI selected thing that is set up to be based on the encapsulated values of some entity. Now, people will say, oh, but that will make everybody be in that sort of echo chamber of they'll only hear about things that they wanted to hear about anyway. Well, realistically, welcome to our species, so to speak. That's what happens, that's what happens anyway. I mean, some people like me would I think I would really like it, the brand that says, we're going to give you a mixture of all kinds of things and we're going to show you all kinds of different points of view. I'd probably sign up for that one. But that's me, and wouldn't claim that that's necessarily either the better thing to do or the thing that most people would choose to do. But I think that and in fact, then people can give arguments for, hey, this is a really good thing to sign up for, and maybe people would do things if they thought that was an important thing for the world to encourage people to sign up for those, see these different points of view. I mean, the things that I tend to see as a practical matter, I'm a little bit disappointed often to see the lack of interest in other points of view and the absolute conviction that some particular point of view is the right thing, it's the right thing. And, everything else is fake news or whatever else. I'm always a little disappointed by that. I tend to take the point of view that, I suppose I'm more optimistic about people, and I kind of believe that people should be more capable of thinking for themselves, so to speak. And if you give them sort of a little bit more information, that it's respect for people is like, let them think for themselves, so to speak. But that's a complicated issue in its own right, because I know, in some controversial issues that have come up even the last few years, I've been curious enough that I've gone and looked at the raw data myself to say, did this really happen? Did it not happen? How is this? What's really going on? And, let's assume that the raw data is correct, and it probably is in most cases. Sometimes you can tell it's fake, but that's a different matter. You can see when the number of this thing was exactly, 1 million or something. It's like, come on, that couldn't possibly be right. But ignoring that, which is a small effect, you look at this data, and it's often, to me, as I think, not completely shabby, analyzer of data and kind of understander of models of things. It's surprisingly unobvious what's going on. And you often have to know a lot of stuff, and I don't know the answers in most of these cases. You have to know a lot of stuff that isn't just on its face in the data, so to speak. You have to know a lot of stuff about how that data really comes to be the way it is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it isn't really, it's not, just say, well, give people the raw data, then they can figure everything out. That's also not going to work, because it's really hard to do that. So anyway, that's all right, let's see. People commenting on this. Okay, this is an interesting comment from Parmenides. It's like voting for algorithms in elections. Algorithm personalities or bias will be increasingly important. Yeah, that is an interesting point. I mean, let's imagine, it's an interesting thought experiment. So, democracy as it is today was sort of made possible by the arrival of literacy in the world. I mean, it's tough to, you have to know a certain amount to have it be plausible that you can vote in a meaningful way for things. And that's something that, maybe 500 years ago started to become widely possible as, there was things like literacy spread. And so the question comes about in the modern world with computation the way it is, and so on, how do we think about processes of government? And, in the blockchain world, there's lots of discussion about DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. People get a little bit confused about what those should be and what they really are. And we could talk about that. But I think that the question, the sort of exercise, the almost philosophical, the political philosophy, the computational political philosophy exercise is, given that we now have all this computational capability, how does that affect things, the way that we think about things like government? Now, government at some level is like an algorithm. It's a machine. It's you set up laws, and then the government is the implementer of those things. You set up a bunch of rules, and then the government is sort of a machine for implementing those rules. It's very similar, actually, to what would happen if we actually wrote an algorithm for how we want, a country to run or something like that, except that right now it's implemented with people and legal contracts and documents and so on. And so the question is, if we were to the point where instead of saying it will be, I don't know, let's say, who can we pick on? The FDA, let's say, I don't know, we could pick any of these, or FCC, let's say, instead of it being, the FCC with people deciding things about spectrum allocation and whatever else, let's just invent, an AI that's going to do that. And then, and Parmenides is making this comment, and then you could imagine, okay, let's, instead of voting for, and obviously one doesn't vote for people in specific government agencies, but sort of carrying that a little bit further, rather than saying we're going to vote for so-and-so to be in charge of X, say, okay, we've got 5 algorithms that might be in charge, and maybe we can see the computational language code This is something, I think Wolfram language is kind of the only plausible way of representing those kinds of real world things in computational form. So you see a bunch of Wolfram language code, and it's like, are you going to vote for this lump of code? Are you going to vote for that lump of code or that lump of code? Whichever, you got 5 choices. One of them is going to run this particular aspect of your government, and which one do you want to pick? Now, people might say, oh, but if you can see the code, people are going to hack it in some way. Well, look at the tax code, for example. There's a giant industry that says, given the tax code as it is, and that's a code written in legalese, so to speak, let's find all the different ways that we can find loopholes and do this and optimize that and so on and so on and so on. That's already happening. There's nothing particularly more extreme about having a piece of actual computational language code where that's the way it runs. So yes, I think that's an interesting possibility, is kind of vote for the algorithms. Now, I have to say that in the operation of there's a lot of sort of blindsiding that can happen when you say, let's turn everything into this sort of computational language code, and then that's what's going to run things. And oh, there's something completely unexpected that happened, and it falls in the code in this particular way. Some machine learning classifier. You think that this machine learning classifier is classifying grades of fruit or something, and suddenly one day, this is too horrible a thought. One of these pieces of fruit, a little maggot crawls out of the piece of fruit, and the fruit classifier is like, oh, that's an amazing piece of fruit. That's a grade AAA piece of fruit, because it wasn't trained on anything about maggots in the fruit or whatever it is. And then you've got something where a human would say, you just got that completely wrong. That's just totally crazy. But when you've got this computational, now not every human might say that. They might see, it might be that case, it's sort of obvious from human sort of external common sense. But there are plenty of other cases where you might say, oh, that piece of fruit has turned a nice purple color. I really like that color, and there's no problem with that. Oh, well, it actually happens to be poisonous, but that's something beyond sort of human perception to be able to tell. So in any case, I think this question of sort of what you can run, could you vote for AIs, so to speak? In a sense, if you're in a democracy and it's like campaign promises, it's like if you're voting for an AI, you're kind of guaranteed it will do what it said it was going to do, in the sense that, look, you voted for this piece of code, you get what you voted for, so to speak. You might not like it, but that's what you get. So it's sort of an interesting thought experiment to think through some of those kinds of things. I would say that one of the points about AI content selection is perhaps not, that there are cases where you're voting for something that's going to decide, whether to go to war, whether to do this, whether to make some very, very big decision. But when it's a question of, oh, you're going to see this piece of content versus that piece of content in this feed, it's not such a dramatic decision, but it's a decision where it has to be made many, many, many times. It has to be made, let's say on 1 billion pieces of content per day or something like this. So it has to be a decision that's somewhat lightweight to make. And I think that's an optimal case. That's a good case for kind of the encapsulated AI decision maker, rather than let's use AI and let's there are plenty of science fiction movies that stories that could go along these lines. Let's use the AI to decide who's going to win the war or not. Nobody will actually go to war. They'll just have the AI cogitate for a while and then say, you win, you lose type thing. Those high stakes decisions are very different from I'm going through 1 billion pieces of content. Do you want to show me that cat video or that cat video type thing? So I think that's a much better case for this kind of encapsulated AI ethics, so to speak, is this case where you're doing automated content selection at a high rate, so to speak. So let's see. So D0 is commenting that a master AI will basically mimic a human, a well-rounded human derived from all the information out there. See, the problem is that, like you say, okay, let's have AIs behave ethically. Okay, so one sort of zeroth idea for how to teach them what is ethical behavior is just show them what the humans do. Okay, then a lot of humans are going to say, that's not right. There are lots of humans doing things that are really bad. Let's show them the perfect human. Okay, where's the perfect human? How do we decide what the perfect human is? Well, then you're in the same sort of regress of you got to decide what you want type thing. And there's no ground truth. There's the ground truth of what humans actually do, but many people would say we can do better than what humans actually normally do. We want to be the better version of ourselves. But then it's kind of like a vector, the better vector. What direction does the better vector point in? Well, different people will have different opinions about the better vector. I mean, some people might say, oh, I don't know, in a very extreme case, they might say, we humans are doing so much damage and so many terrible things. The better vector is there just aren't any humans. So that vector, it's kind of, that's the, that vector, at least, the answer. There aren't any humans, so there's nothing more to discuss. But most people will probably not think that was the better vector. But in any case, so I mean, that choice is a very arbitrary choice. But now you might say, and I was curious about this at one point, let's curate the ethical systems of the world. And let's try to make sort of a feature space plot of all the different ethical, decisions in the world. So for example, a typical, type of thing is like one of these trolley problem type things. You're deciding you've got, 3 baby elephants versus 1 endangered bird. And you're deciding, if the train car is going to kill one set of these things, which should it be, the baby elephants or the endangered bird? And then let's have 18 baby elephants versus whatever. And you keep going with these kinds of questions, which are very kind of philosophical debate type questions that until you're making that self-driving car or that autonomous weapon or something, and you actually have to burn that decision into code. It's funny, the woman who invented that trolley problem thing was a philosophy professor in Oxford. My mother was also a philosophy professor in Oxford, and that person was a friend of my mother's. So it's kind of funny to see this come up again as kind of a thing where that was a philosopher's debate for a long time, and like in the end, the philosopher's debate has to turn into code, and that's the sort of the situation that we're sort of starting to be in. But now this question of, okay, let's curate the ethical systems in the world, and let's say, in this ethical system, the baby elephants win. In that ethical system, the endangered bird wins. So then the question would be, are there universals? Are there enough universals you could build something on that? Are there kind of definite, okay, you've got these 3 personality types of ethical systems or something, pick ABC type thing. How does that work? What is the structure of ethics space, so to speak? And I looked at this a bit. It's a messy subject, and I couldn't make much out of it. I mean, there are a few things like, various versions of the golden rule, do to others as you expect people to do to you type thing. That seems to be pretty common. I think there are things that are very sort of Darwinian in the sense that they're things which, if you want society to evolve in a prosperous way or a way that's going to continue well, these are things you probably want to have with the case. I mean, for example, if you have a principle that that humans are a bad thing, you should wipe them all out. Well, then that's the end of society, and that's not good for natural selection, so to speak. But if you ask the question, is there a body of things about which everybody agrees? The answer is not really. And is it the case that, and people will also, I mean, the other place where it gets complicated is if you make some core ethical decision, the consequences of that ethical decision are kind of irreducibly hard to figure out. And so somebody says, well, I want this. You say, oh, I didn't realize that would mean this and this and this. And maybe, there's a story of computational irreducibility, and it's impossible to tell. There will always be unexpected consequences and so on. So it gets complicated to do that. And I think in the end, and this relates again to this question of, if you're a company that owns some giant automated content selection system, should you just say, I'm going to figure out the master algorithm and I'm just going to decide this for everybody? I just don't think that will work in a way that makes sense. And I think you have to admit that there are different people, there are different groups of people with different value systems. Where do the value systems come from? Well, it's a nature and nurture and other things story. We don't really know all of it. Probably lots of nurture involved in that. Probably lots of, you grew up in this kind of cultural setting, so that's what you're used to, and so on. I mean, it's similar to saying, if we look at something like, I don't know, architecture, let's say, we look at, and we are shown some piece of architecture that's very familiar. It has, a room that's rectangular. It's got, things that look like they're sort of physically work that way, kind of reminds us of things in nature. It's pretty comfortable for us. Then you show us something which is really weird, and it's got, all these weird pentagonal pieces and weird angles and this kind of thing. And for many people, that's kind of like a disorientingly uncomfortable kind of situation. And I think the same thing is true for a lot of these kinds of cultural things. And it's a question of, well, there's an environment. We are, born into a certain world, and that determines a lot of the way that we see things and what we're comfortable with. Now, you could argue, well, we should be comfortable with other things, and maybe I might think that about some kinds of things that I see. But there's a question of where are the levers that move that, and it probably isn't in some company deciding sort of preemptively, we're just going to tilt this thing in this particular way. So Parmenides, I noticed, commenting, the world is highly dynamic, so one AI might be ideal for a while, and then another will be better. Yeah, one of the things that one might imagine is, let's imagine that you were burning in. You were saying, we're going to build AIs, they're going to be super powerful, they're going to run the world. Let's give them a constitution that is the way we want them to be. Okay, and so one feature of that constitution better be the AIs can't like change their own constitution, because then we're not determining how we want the AIs to be. So you have the scary situation of, we're in 2022, let's make the AI constitution and burn it in for all the rest of history. And that's sort of what, in a sense, people, in some of the, for example, religious traditions, people are like, this was the thing, this is the book, so to speak, and that's the tradition, that's what we want to continue, into the infinite future. We're talking about, with AIs, we'd be talking about the same kind of thing, except it would be much more extreme in the sense that this really is the core code that's running, that's determining the ethics for AIs in the future. I was curious, if you look at the actual constitutions of the world, there's a nice website that collects them, and you look at how they actually work and how changeable they are. And that there seem to be three categories of constitutions. One's where basically it said a super democracy, a super majority is needed to change this constitution. I think the US has some aspects of that in its constitution. If enough people want it changed democratically in some sense, then let's change it. Case number one. Case number two, there is ultimately a supreme ruler determined in some way or another, and ultimately the supreme ruler will decide. That's case number two. Case number three, that seemed to be true in some of the sort of Soviet style constitutions, which I found kind of amusing, was that there was a mechanism, and the mechanism involved a committee. We'll create a committee to create a committee to create a committee to figure out whether to create a committee to create a committee, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing is almost an infinite regress of committees. And it becomes kind of this sort of computationally undecidable thing, whether you can get a change or not, because it's all committees of committees of committees, so to speak. So those seem to be the three cases. And I think there is no sort of right answer to that again. And it's a difficult thing. If you have the super powerful, it's kind of a type of thinking that theologians have done in the past. Of, by the time you have the super powerful, all powerful AI that's running things, and then you need to make a change in the all powerful whatever, how does that possibly work? Because it's the all powerful thing, and so it has the power to prevent itself from being changed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think that through? Don't know the answer. Let's see. Okay, let's see. Okay, so comments from people from space-time, I think, about Twitter and ranking algorithms. Just let users do it with sorting and filters. Yeah, I mean, up to a point, that's a very reasonable thing. I mean, I think it depends on whether you want to learn about things that you didn't already know about. This question of sorting and filters, I mean, that's essentially what we're talking about with curated feed, is defining those filters. And the question is, you can say, well, I'm going to make a filter and I'm going to write my own piece of Wolfram language code to write that filter. Or you're going to say, look, I just trust that, I don't know, pick a, what's a good example? So I'm hard pressed to think of an example, I don't know, pick some organization. I just trust that organization will be picking well, and that they will have done a good job building the AI, building the filter effectively, which is, you can say filter, that sounds simple. You can say AI, that sounds complicated, but in the end, they're very similar kinds of things to pick that content. People commenting here, it's funny to watch people getting excited about Twitter again. When Twitter first was a thing, it was like, how's this going to work? But then I realized it's a very interesting thing. It's really, if it is executed well, it is a thing that is very good for the world. It's useful. It's a way of really having a discussion in the world, which is something that is sort of now technologically possible. I mean, I suppose answering my own question a little bit about what does computation bring to, and the modern sort of communication and computational world bring to questions of governance, so to speak. One of the things is you can have a discussion, you can have a conversation in a way that wasn't really true before. I mean, yes, you could have somebody write a letter to the editor, to the newspaper that was going to be published, or somebody stand on a soapbox on a street corner. But now there's a much more global ability to have a conversation if you don't block that conversation. If you block the conversation, it doesn't do any good. But that's the thing. And the question of how do you make that conversation work, and how do you make that conversation kind of get to the point where it's not polarizing out and just sort of splurting out in absurd directions, or if it is splurting out in absurd directions, that the people who want that, what you think of as absurd direction, they're happily living in that absurd direction, and and it doesn't bother other people. Now, of course, then you quickly regress into all kinds of things which would be interesting to think through in more detail, with kind of a clean slate of how to think about it. Of what do you do with things that are there's a set of things that countries just decide are against their laws. Okay, that's up to the country. It's made its decision. Whether you agree with it or not, that's a different issue. But then you can put that away in one bucket. Then there's the question of things where people just think, oh, that's not the right thing to do, or whatever else, or you want some dynamic where you try and make things, this is where you get into trouble, where you start saying, well, actually, I want to make this dynamic where everybody's going to have more civil discourse and things like this. This is where you go in the slippery slope that ends in the sort of horrors of all kinds of things. I was rereading a little while ago that as sort of an appendix to George Orwell's 1984 that was looking at recently about what was it, the Ministry of, probably the Ministry of Information or something, or it might have been called the Anti-Disinformation or something Ministry, I don't know, but it wasn't called that because it wasn't at that time. But you quickly descend into a sort of morass of it's not clear what to do, type things, I think. So anyway, I think that this question of as soon as you have, I mean, the issue is, can you have a principle where the principle is to not have principles, so to speak, as in where you say, well, by principle I mean some particular cultural value. Can you set things up so that you can have a world, a Twitter world at least, in which you don't have to have made, in which the number of global decisions that is made is as small as possible. I think that's the interesting question, and that's sort of a mixture of practicality of machine learning algorithms together with practicality of sort of business issues about how do you motivate people to put effort into curation and so on. How does that all work together with sort of more societal, philosophical kinds of questions about how to set that up. These are interesting problems, and I think if there's a real opportunity to think that through, because the way that Twitter evolved, it's like it didn't really have a moment where it's like, okay, now it's time to think this through. I think perhaps now is that moment, and that could be really interesting. Okay, there's a question here. How can it be from Eggy? How can we avoid it that the world turns into an electronic panopticon when everything goes digital? Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think what you mean by that is sort of everybody sees everything, and what is the kind of the story of a world where everybody sees everything and there's no kind of privacy of things and so on. I think it's a little bit of okay, so first point is that what services are centralized versus what services are more local and decentralized. And by decentralized, I don't necessarily mean blockchain, which has its own kind of centralization, but in the sense that it's sort of everything is going onto one ledger and things like this. But the question really is, when it comes to something like a social network, let's say, and it's like, well, somebody can come in and peek into the social network and see, oh, those people are doing this bad stuff on the social network. Now, why is it even possible to do that? Well, it's possible to do that because the social network has been deeply centralized. There's it is believed that sort of there's an economy of scale, and there's an AI sort of economy of effectiveness, so to speak, that says you should get everything together in one place. And you don't want, and it's also from a practical business point of view, that's something that allows one to sell ads centrally, and that's the way those businesses work and so on. I think that the thing that's interesting is that it's not obvious you have to do it that way. It could be the case that all social network stuff is somehow peer-to-peer. It's got, and everybody just has, the information about their local social network information plus some sort of, encrypted connections to other people and so on, and that there is no central there. And that's a very different picture. And I think that the thing that is interesting is different services have evolved in different ways. Like the web, for example, has never been, maybe it's becoming increasingly so, but it could have been the case that at the beginning of the web, it was just like there were, and there sort of were, CompuServe and AOL and things like that and GeoCities and so on, were sort of providing these centralized, you're on the web, you're on this server, this is a centralized thing. But in fact, most of the way that the web has evolved is a quite decentralized thing where everybody's operating their own server, and there's a whole, that there are all these issues about, exactly how everybody should route traffic. But in a first approximation, that's kind of working in a very uncentralized way. So that's one example, very different from the way that social media evolved, where it's much more centralized, or the way that search evolved, again, much more centralized. And email, for example, evolved differently in different countries. In some places it was fairly uncentralized. In other places, there was a dominant company, and that was the servers that got used. So, I think that that's the thing that makes for sort of the Panopticon story is partly about the centralization of data and the centralization of systems. And I think that's a little bit of an accident of history in some of these cases. Now, once you're in a particular place with respect to that contingent history, it can be pretty difficult to get out of that place because, by the time there's enough hundreds of billions of dollars that are riding on that particular business model, moving, jumping to a different horse, so to speak, is a really difficult thing to achieve in the world. And it's something where that different horse, which might not have any kind of economic oomph behind it to make such a transition occur. So I think, that's why, that's why it's interesting to see Elon making the choice to get involved in Twitter, because that's a kind of a piece of the sort of the economic story that is rather factored away from kind of the bulk. Everybody wants to make their dollar in this place or that place. Let's see some comments. People reminding me that the thing in 1984 is the Ministry of Truth. A lovely name. I just wonder, again, I could expound at some length about what, all the things that go wrong with a fact being a fact. One of the things that's an issue for us with Wolfram Alpha is that, particularly insofar as people are using Wolfram Alpha as an oracle for things like blockchains and computational contracts, it's like, did something happen in the world? That's the question of interest. And then we'll just write a contract that says it happened in the world if Wolfram Alpha says it happened. And so, if it says it rained in a particular place, we'll assume that that's just the true situation. Well, as more and more gets built on that, and you have more and more kind of chains of computational contracts that say if this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then, one of the things that becomes important is if we suddenly say this happened in the world, and, our sort of feed of fact, so to speak, says this happens in the world, that's going to start some giant domino thing. We better get it right. And that domino thing, it's kind of like a thermodynamic process. You're never going to be able to undomino the dominoes, so to speak. Once you say this happened, chain of consequences, sort of expanding chain of consequences, you'll never be able to roll it back. So you're kind of forced to be, you're forced to do the best you can to get it right. So the case, a typical case that's really complicated is, who won election X? Okay, you would think that's straightforward. There's rules, there's in different countries, in different places, there's, this decision, that decision, this is a well-defined thing. Now, remember also, you don't want to wait too long to come up with a conclusion, because it better not be the case that all these computational contracts that depend on who won this or that election are hanging on, they're all hanging up. There's this giant blocking that's happening in the computational contract infrastructure of the world, because all these contracts depend on this thing, but we don't know that thing yet. I mean, from a sort of physics point of view, we can talk about it in terms of causal graphs and so on. There's this event that didn't happen yet. And so all of the future light cone of that event, sorry, that comes from me spending too much time in physics. All of the sort of future causality from that event can't happen yet, because we haven't determined whether that event happened. So then the question is, how do you actually do it? And, we haven't had to implement this yet, because there hasn't been enough kind of hanging on those threads yet. But I was trying to figure out, what would we actually do if, if, for example, we know perfectly well that we move the lever this way or that way, there's, $100 million on each of the sides of the lever, so to speak. And, how do we do it? How do we make that decision? Now, obviously, people have those decisions that they make in terms of, I don't know, ratings agencies and all kinds of other things, where they're corporately making decisions that have those kinds of, that move levers like that. But it's like, what are we going to do when it's an external fact? How are we going to deal with this? And it's like, I think the best I've been able to come up with is, it's sort of a weird kind of human system. Let's say we have 100 data curators out around the world. So a random collection of 100 people, but not random, a collection of 100 trained data curators, similar to what we have today in the Wolfram Alpha, in our Wolfram Alpha organization. And then, although you probably want something where it's not people with a particular organization that they, et cetera, that's complicated in its own right. But then basically you say, okay, some issue comes up and it's like, we got to decide in the next 15 minutes, what are we going to do with this? Or decide that we have to punt and we can't decide this in this 15-minute period. Okay, pick 5 of these curators at random. And then you say, okay, you've got 15 minutes to decide. We're going to use the equivalent of, exam proctoring software. And, you can even live stream your screen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But now you've got to figure out in 15 minutes, what do you think is true about this supposed fact? And, my theory about that is that we can't guarantee to, quotes, always get it right. In other words, it says, you know, so-and-so won the election, somebody says, and then, well, actually, you know, there's a parade of tanks, you know, just, you know, that are approaching the whatever it is, you know, the Parliament Square or something, who are all saying, no, 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 that's not true, and we're going to blow the whole thing up, and you know, it all gets very complicated. And then it's like, well, did they really, or you know, or there's some whole challenge through some chain of legal, you know, legal challenges and so on. It's like, did they really do that or not? So I think you know, the thing one has to do, and my criterion for figuring this out is, you know, we can at least get to the point where we might be wrong, but at least we're not crooked, so to speak. That there is nothing that is influencing beyond just like, these are just people, and in the end it's going to come down to people trying to make decisions, and they will try and make decisions to the best of their ability. They may fail to get it right, but they were not influenced in some way by some, you know, larger force or whatever in doing that. And I think that's sort of the thing one would try to achieve there. Let's see. Okay, a comment here from Spacetime saying, I do think the marketplace approach isn't a bad option, but seems like the optimal way to do that is just reopen the Twitter API and let different people create clients. Yeah, could very well be. I mean, that seems like I think the only issue is, I kind of think that the more Twitter itself can provide an environment, app store, tooling, etc., to create those clients, the more one's going to be in a position. See, I think one wants organizations that are mostly about their value system and not mostly about their machine learning prowess, for example, to be capable of creating meaningful clients, so to speak, meaningful curated feeds. And so I think it's important to sort of build centrally enough of a platform that it's possible to do that. So you don't have to be, you know, somebody capable of managing, you know, billions of tweets flowing through and managing machine learning pipelines and complicated distributed computing infrastructure and so on. If you can get it to the point where you have tooling that lets you just make the value judgments in a way that, so, you know, you just can, you know, tweak the AI, and then the actual implementation of the AI is done in a way that is, you know, having access to sort of all of the distributed computing, all of the high-speed stuff and so on, all of the training data, all that kind of thing that's needed. So that's I think, you know, it's certainly a possible step to just sort of reopen the API, but I think it becomes more realistic, and it allows the population of organizations that can provide curation to be much broader in a much more interesting way if you've provided a strong platform and tooling for that. Parmenides comments, I think in reference to a particular thing I said, you end up with a social network as good as the people in the network. I don't think you can elevate people by moderating what they're allowed to say. I have to say, I personally, my prejudice is that you're absolutely right about that. And that sort of the concept that you have a situation where the only way to keep the ship stable is by kind of shutting down discourse about this or that thing, that seems wrong to me. I mean, maybe that's just a prejudice on my part from the fact that, you know, I'm a person who likes to think about things and likes to understand things, and thinks that so you know, that you know, that you may take that as sort of my prejudice. Yeah, that would be what I would say. Let's see, Woman comments, I don't think you can avoid bias. It's just inherent to language and minimally complex knowledge units. Bias should be a feature more than something to avoid. It's more useful to understand bias than to attempt to neutralize it. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think this is the point of, you know, you've got to have these different sort of value systems and sort of different islands, towers of values, and they represent, you know, yeah, you can't, in the end, if okay, you're right to say, I think that it's inherent to language. When we say a chair, we are biased to not think about the what would be an example. We're not thinking about the two-legged self-maintaining, thing that is really intended for animals with tails. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but whenever we have a word for a thing, for example, we are picking a particular class of things we're imagining that word connotes, and there will necessarily be what you could think of as bias, and we're ignoring the chairs for octopuses, for example. We are biased against chairs for octopuses because that's not what our term chair usually means to us. And yes, I think that's a typical kind of thing. I mean, I think the other thing that can happen is, there is the way the world is, and there's the way you want the world to be, given your particular prejudices, value system, whatever else. And then there's the question, which people will argue about, of is there a vector towards the better world? And I claim there is no such thing. That is simply that's sort of a fiction, that there's an ultimate vector towards a better world. I mean, if we look at human history, for example, we might say, has the arrow of time of human history led us to a better world? People probably mostly say no. In some ways it's a better world. Clearly, many things, I would say, on average, if I were to, rate it for myself, the world now versus the world 1,000 years ago, today is just unbelievably much better. I certainly wouldn't be around and alive and kicking with high probability at the ancient age I'm at, and able to spend a bunch of my time thinking about abstract science and all this kind of thing, and eating pieces of chocolate and all that kind of thing, wouldn't be likely 1,000 years ago. I get to have a much more, to me, interesting and fulfilled life today than 1,000 years ago. But nevertheless, that's sort of a this sort of, people might say, I think people wouldn't say it's always becoming a better world. But then, this question of, well, what direction makes it better? I mean, I remember people saying, look at this, what was it? The bonobos, I think. It was the primates, where people said, look, they have a better society than human society. They've got all these good things going on, which we think sound really good. And I remember wondering to myself, I wonder what these creatures eat. And it turns out, of course, they're carnivorous, and they have all kinds of things that happen in that in the pursuit of food. It's what seems like a better world isn't always a better world. I mean, it's also I think the other thing that could happen is you end up with in a sense, if everything is completely, one could go on about this. I mean, I'm only going to end up expressing my prejudices about the world, so to speak. But I think the main sort of meta prejudice is that there are always going to be prejudices, and that's kind of that's a necessary thing, and that's that almost without that, things like, what do we mean by chair? It's you have to have kind of that the built-in, the existing knowledge, the existing view of what that could possibly mean in order for even communication to work. All right, well, I should probably wrap up soon. Wasn't planning to talk about Twitter today, but that was interesting. Let's see if there's anything I can answer quickly here. There's a question from Architect. What tools do you use to get refocused, and how do you set yourself up for more creative exploratory activities? This question about getting refocused, I've still been tweaking that. So for example, when I write things, and I write quite a lot, you might even argue too much, too long, kinds of posts that I put out and things like this. But when I'm writing those, one of the questions is, I write up to certain points, and then I'm going to start again. I'm going to pick it up again the next day, let's say. what is the optimal way in which to set it up so that I can best pick it up again? And I would say that when I have some section that I'm writing and I haven't quite finished that section, sometimes I think, oh, that'll be a good place to pick it up again. I've got momentum there. That's not right, at least not for me, because that momentum is there in that moment in my state of mind as I'm writing it. And then I can continue it. But if I have to recreate that momentum, it doesn't work at all. And I end up with a much worse situation. So I think one of the things I found that for writing things, at least, that is kind of useful sometimes, is, if I've got a reason to reread what I've written, I'm adding links, I'm proofreading it, I'm doing something like that, so up to the point where I get to. Sometimes I'm like, I can't read this. I wrote it. It's boring for me to read this. But if I can make myself reread it, that's a pretty good way of generating momentum for me to get restarted and say, okay, now I understand. Okay, the obvious next thing to say is blah. So that's a thing that I've found useful there. I would say that whenever, okay, another form of focusing for me is just start writing stuff down. Just, you're trying to think about something, start making concrete notes about what you're thinking about. For me, it's kind of externalizing kind of what I'm thinking about. Really, it helps me to focus the ideas. And also once I've thought about something, it's like one of these principles of if you're worried about falling asleep, and you're thinking about something, and just write it down, because then you can let it go, and you'll remember it the next day if you need to remember it. But otherwise, you're kind of looping, trying to remember that thing. I think it's the same thing often as I'm thinking about stuff. If I can just write it down, then it's like, okay, move on to the next thought type thing, rather than looping on that and being held back by that. Well, anyway, so that's at least some thought about refocusing. And talking of refocusing, I think I need to go. And I'm actually about to do my 4th live stream of the day. My gosh, this is the season when we are working towards a new version of our system, Wolfram language, and working towards 13.1. And this is my season of design reviews for 13.1. And I have another one coming up in just a few minutes here, which I'll be live streaming again. So you can test my hypothesis that I'm okay at context switching between one kind of activity and another by seeing whether I can just jump right in to the discussion. I think we're talking about geometry and graphs and new functionality for that there. But anyway, thanks for joining me here. And actually, for people who have thoughts about, I'm starting to think a bit about Twitterology and so on. And so I'd be interested to hear thoughts about that. And for me, it's at this point just kind of an interesting intellectual exercise, let's say. But I think it's one that if one can surface good ideas, is a good thing. All right. Well, thanks for joining me, and